I've loaded a raster dataset as we asked you to on the lab. It's a DEM of an area along the St. Croix River, a little bit northeast of the Twin Cities. And I want to show you how to do a hillshade calculation. But first, let's go over how to symbolize this raster in a different way. So here I have my data, and you get a slightly different set of options when you click on the Symbology tab here or go to show the Symbology. It basically allows you to mess with the stretch, so you can say where you want the high and low values, and you can mess with this, but mostly I just wanted to show that you can pick these color schemes, and we suggest this elevation color scheme. So you left click there and it gives you this elevation color scheme applied to the raster. Each raster cell is given a value depending on where it falls along this from low to high. Now again, as with other data layers that we showed before, you can set up a color scheme yourself if you don't like this one, again by adding these breakpoints and adding different changes in different color along the way. We're not going to do that here, but just know that it exists. Now, one of the things we also want you to take a look at is creating a hillshade. This is a common sort of enhancement to these kinds of maps, raster elevation maps. And so in the toolbox, if you look then in the geoprocessing menu, which that opens up here with this geoprocessing tab, you have lots of tools here, and if you navigate down to the spatial analyst tools, then down into the surface tools here, you can see that there is a hillshade tool. Now if you browse this, you can see that there's just tons of tools, and a lot of learning how to use ArcGIS or any GIS effectively is to get familiar with the range of things you can do, and that's what you're doing over the course of this lab and this semester. So we'll double left click on hillshade here, and it asks us for an input raster. So we'll go there and connect to the raster that we have displayed and accept an output. Now hillshade is a way of showing an illumination and then shadowing to give a 3D impression, as we've described very quickly in the lab, and we'll talk about later when we get to chapter 11. But it's a useful enough and common enough way to enhance maps that we wanted to show it early, and we'll show it again later so that maybe we'll remember at some point in the future. The azimuth is where the sun is placed, starting at 0 at the north and then wrapping around. So that puts the sun up here in the northwest quadrant, an azimuth of 315. So 0, and this would be 90, and down here would be 180 and 270. And that gives a most realistic impression of the shadowing that we see when we look at the landscape from above, let's say from a plane. And we're going to change the altitude. That's how far we are above the horizon. A lower horizon gives a better impression of the relief, but if you get too low, you get too much of the area covered. And we ask you to increase this vertical exaggeration 3 or 4 or something like that here. Because it's a relatively low relief environment, we wouldn't see much if we kept that at 1. We'll also model shadows to improve the effect. Then we hit run. Now it's relatively long-winded, but it will display here in just a minute. So now we have the hillshade, and it doesn't look like much if we look at it here in this small view to save space for the video, but you can see then it does give you, when we zoom in, the relief of the area. And so we go ahead and show then this on top of our elevation value. Now, a real common thing for folks to do is to show semi-transparent layers, so you get both of them. You get both the elevation effect from low to high and the hillshade showing through. So if I left click on the appearance, when rasters show up, there's a slider here that's our layer transparency, and I have this hillshade layer selected. So if I sweep over the transparency, I can see that I get the hillshade letting the elevation to shine through or show through. And this you can't see as well zoomed out, but if I zoom in and show this, I can get this transparency from 0, and you don't see the elevation below at all, to somewhere in the mid that gives a good sense of both the elevation and the hill shading to give the terrain relief. And then if I go all the way over, it's completely transparent. I get nothing of the hill shade. So somewhere in the middle here is generally pretty good, where I get the colors, but also the shading to allow things to pop. Now, another thing we want you to do with this data layer is to load some NHD hydrography data. So these data are data that we've downloaded from the internet, and we basically want you to add them to this data layer. Now you add water bodies and flow lines. And so we load the flow lines here, and there are a couple of things we want to show you about how to symbolize these. Now, there's a type variable in the flow lines here, and it loads lots of types, but we're only interested in showing some of them. So the artificial paths in the streams and rivers. You often want to delete other values because you just don't want to show them in the data set. So I can right click here and remove a class of values, and so it gets removed both from the table of contents and from the symbology. It just doesn't show up. So again, I right click on this middle column on the name, and then I left click on remove, and it takes it out of both of them. So I can go ahead and do that. So that's a way to get rid of values you don't want. Then you can left click and format the symbols the same old way you always do. So that's something that's quite useful. Now, we also want you to load the water bodies, and we show you in those how to get rid of the all other values, because you can't delete the all other values. So we show you here the water bodies, and we want to use unique values again, and we have the type of water body. So these are lakes and ponds and reservoirs, and we want to keep both of these so we can symbolize both these individually with colors that we'd like. And we want to show the lakes and ponds. The problem is, for this all other values, we don't want that to show up, and if I right click, I can't remove it. But what I can do is I can go and click on the symbol for it, and then just basically have it not appear. And so if I apply that, it doesn't show up, and then I can go back to the description, and for the all the other values, basically edit the label and have the label be blank, and that essentially makes it not appear in my table of contents. So if I go ahead and display it, they won't show up, and so that way I can have a nice clean kind of display when I put my legend on my map.